This was the moment power learned to wear the face of God. The temples no longer spoke for heaven. They spoke for kings. Faith became law. Obedience became sacred. And from the clay of devotion, humanity built its first throne. For thousands of years, people had prayed only to survive. They sang to the wind, begged the rivers for mercy, and feared the fire that gave them light. But when they learned to control those forces, the center of faith began to shift. The world was no longer a mystery to endure. It was a system to manage. In the southern plains of Mesopotamia, 2 rivers cut across the desert like veins. When the floods came, the land came alive. When the floods failed, everything died. To survive, people dug channels, measured rain, and stored grain. From that labor, a new kind of order was born. At its heart stood the temple. The first temples were simple, raised platforms of clay where people left offerings to the unseen powers. But generation after generation, they rebuilt them higher and stronger. The temple became the axis of the city, the place where survival and meaning met. At Eridu, archaeologists would later find 18 layers of temples, each built directly atop the last. Every century added a new foundation. Every generation built its faith in brick. The temple was more than a house of gods. It was a blueprint of civilization. Inside its walls, labor was coordinated, food was stored, trade was organized, and rituals were timed with the rising of the stars. The one who managed all this became more than a priest. He became the voice of order itself. At first, he was called the keeper, the intermediary between heaven and earth. His duty was to maintain balance between flood and drought, between the gods above and the people below. But when the floods came on time, the people praised his prayers. When they failed, they waited for him to make amends. In that fragile space between need and explanation, authority was born. The first rulers did not conquer with armies. They ruled through interpretation. They learned to read the patterns of the world and claim them as messages from the divine. When the rivers rose, they said the gods had spoken. When they receded, they said the gods demanded obedience. Knowledge became prophecy, and prophecy became power. By 5500 BCE, villages across the delta shimmered with canals and shrines. The Obaid culture had turned agriculture into ritual and labor into ceremony. Every harvest was recorded, every flood predicted, every offering measured. The priesthood evolved into a new class of specialists, astronomers, engineers, and administrators. They were the first bureaucrats, and their authority came from both science and sanctity. At Eridu, they worshipped Enki, lord of fresh water and wisdom. His temple stood on an artificial mound above the marshes. During rituals, priests poured water into carved channels that ran beneath the floor, symbolizing the god's breath through the soil. The ceremony had a practical effect that cooled the structure, but its meaning was far greater. Water itself became sacred. The management of the flood was now divine work. To control the river was to speak in the language of the gods. This fusion of faith and engineering changed everything. For the first time, survival depended not only on cooperation but on hierarchy. The temple decided when to plant, how to irrigate, how much to store. It controlled labor, grain, and time. The temple was the first government. The keeper of the temple was the first ruler. Power no longer came from strength, but from order. The people followed not because they were forced, but because they believed. To disobey the temple was to defy heaven itself. In this new structure, every task carried meaning. The farmer who dug a canal was not just working, he was maintaining the balance of the cosmos. The builder who laid bricks for the temple was restoring harmony to the world. Faith had become infrastructure. With abundance came complexity. More fields meant more irrigation. More grain meant more records. Clay tokens were created to track transactions, a cone for grain, a sphere for oil, a cylinder for livestock. They were sealed inside clay envelopes, each marked with symbols of what was stored within. These were the first contracts, the first memory of trust. From these simple marks would later emerge writing itself. Control of those records became the foundation of power. The priest who knew how to count, the keeper who held the tokens, the scribe who marked the tablets, all stood closer to authority than the ones who tilled the fields. Knowledge had become sacred property. The city's survival now depended on a hierarchy of understanding. By 5000 BCE, the southern marshes were threaded with trade routes. Copper from the north, obsidian from the mountains, shells from the Gulf, all passed through temple markets. Each exchange was sanctified as an offering to the gods. The priestly class grew wealthier and more indispensable. They were not rulers in name but in function. The temple owned the fields, managed the water, and claimed the harvests. The sacred had become administrative. The first cities were not born from conquest but from coordination. The temple was their nucleus. Around it, homes clustered like cells around a living core. From its platform, decrees were given in the name of Enki and the heavens. Religion and governance had fused into one mechanism of control. To follow the gods was to follow the rulers. To question the rulers was to risk the collapse of the world's balance. Architecture began to mirror ambition. Temples rose upon stepped terraces, early ziggurats, symbolic mountains where heaven met earth. To climb them was to ascend through creation. Each brick, each stair, carried both meaning and message. Humanity could now reach the divine through its own hands. The act of building had become the act of believing. From above, the temple looked like a pyramid of order rising from chaos. At dawn, sunlight struck its summit first, bathing the priest in gold. The people below watched the reflection dance across the canals. The image was unforgettable, a man illuminated by heaven, standing between light and dust. It was the perfect metaphor for authority. He was the bridge between gods and men. The first two were the face of both. To the people, this order felt natural. Life worked because someone maintained it. The stars returned, the floods arrived, the harvests grew. The temple's predictions became proof of its legitimacy. Each successful season strengthened the illusion that the gods spoke through human hands. And when the rains failed, they did not lose faith. They offered more. Sacrifice reinforced obedience. But as stability deepened, so did division. The temple's granaries grew full, while the outer fields struggled. The keepers of the gods now lived apart, their homes higher and cleaner than the rest. Faith had become hierarchy. The divine no longer lived among the people. It lived above them. Yet, even in their separation, the rulers believed their power was righteous. They saw themselves not as oppressors, but as protectors of cosmic order. Without them, they claimed, the floods would not come and the sun would not rise. The lie was subtle, but it worked. For once, a people accept that order itself is divine. Questioning power becomes sacrilege. By 4500 BCE, the transformation was complete. The temple was the city. The priests were its architects, its engineers, its accountants, and its storytellers. The gods were their justification. This system would outlive them all. It was the prototype of civilization. And so, the voice that once whispered in gratitude began to speak in command. The man who once begged the sky for mercy now declared himself its mouthpiece. Each decree was framed as revelation. Each construction, a divine mandate. Humanity had not yet built an empire, but the blueprint was ready. The earth felt the shift. Where once there had been songs of survival, now there were chants of dominion. The same rivers that had given life now carried tribute. The same clay that had shaped gods now shaped law. Power no longer bowed to heaven. It claimed to define it. Still, the rulers feared what they could not escape. Floods continued to destroy. Storms still arrived unbidden, and time still aged their hands. No ritual could stop decay. No offering could halt death. And so, a new hunger began to grow within them, a hunger not for control, but for permanence. They had mastered the rhythms of nature. Now they wanted to master time itself. In the city of Uruk, one man would take that desire farther than anyone before him. He would not settle for balance or power or obedience. He would chase the oldest dream of all, the dream of living forever. And in doing so, he would give the world its first story of immortality. The city of Uruk rose from the desert like a mirror of the sky. Its walls stretched for miles, built from millions of sun-baked bricks. Each one bore the mark of a human hand. Each hand believed it was building eternity. To its people, Uruk was not just a city. It was proof that order could conquer chaos. Clay had become memory. The world could now be shaped by will alone. At its center stood the temple of Inanna, goddess of love, war, and fertility. Her ziggurat towered above the plain, glowing white in the morning and burning gold at sunset. Below, canals carried water from the Euphrates through fields of barley and gardens of reeds. The city pulsed with rhythm. For the first time, humanity had built something that did not depend on the seasons. It depended on belief. Uruk was the first true metropolis. More than 10,000 people lived within its walls. They worked as potters, weavers, carpenters, brewers, scribes, and priests. At the top stood a figure unlike any before him. The king. He was not simply a ruler. He was the living image of divine order. His words were law because his authority came from the heavens. The king was the axis between mortality and the eternal. His body belonged to time, but his crown belonged to the gods. The greatest of these kings was Gilgamesh. He was said to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, born of a mortal father and a goddess mother. His strength was unmatched. He built Uruk's mighty walls, tamed its floods, and brought its people prosperity. Yet even in all his power, he feared the one enemy that could not be defeated: death. The legend of Gilgamesh was not the story of conquest. It was the story of a man who refused to accept the limits of being human. When his closest companion, Enkidu, died, Gilgamesh was broken. He looked at the lifeless body of his friend and felt the weight of every king who would ever live. Power could not protect against time. He left his throne and wandered through the wilderness searching for the secret of eternal life. His journey took him across mountains and deserts, to the edges of myth. In every place, he found the same truth carved into stone and whispered by the wind. Everything living must die. At the edge of the world, he found Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the Great Flood. Gilgamesh begged him for the secret of immortality, but Utnapishtim told him that the gods kept eternal life for themselves. "You, mortal," he said, "must find meaning in what you can build." Still, Gilgamesh did not give up. He dove into the deep sea to find the plant of youth, the gift of renewal. He found it but lost it to a serpent while resting on the shore. Defeated, he returned to Uruk with empty hands. But as he stood before the walls he had built, something changed. He saw the towers, the canals, the gardens, the streets filled with people. Every brick carried his mark. Every life inside those walls existed because of him. And in that moment, he understood. To live forever was not to escape death. It was to create something that outlasted the body. That realization became humanity's first understanding of eternity. Eternity did not belong to the flesh. It belonged to memory. The story of Gilgamesh was carved into clay tablets in the world's first written language. It became the oldest surviving epic in history. It spoke of love, loss, pride, and wisdom. But beneath it all was the same truth that still defines humanity. The only thing stronger than death is remembrance. Through Gilgamesh, kings learned how to speak to time. They saw that conquest fades but stories endure, that walls crumble but names remain. From that moment, every ruler would build, not just to rule, but to be remembered. The temples became archives of power. Scribes, once recorders of grain, became recorders of history. The king's deeds were pressed into clay and sealed into jars buried beneath foundations. Each inscription carried the same message: I was here. Uruk had invented more than writing. It had invented legacy. The priests turned Gilgamesh's revelation into theology. They taught that the king's spirit did not die but ascended to join the gods. A ruler became divine by dying well and by being remembered. From that belief came the first funerary rituals and the first tombs built to last forever. Immortality was no longer a dream. It was a system. From Sumer to Akkad, from Kish to Yor, the idea spread that kingship was divine. Rule was not a human act but a heavenly duty. The Sumerians said that kingship had descended from heaven. The phrase became the cornerstone of civilization. Each city built its own ziggurat to mirror the mountains of creation. Each ruler carved his name into its foundation. Each generation tried to reach higher, to touch the divine through architecture. They believed that height meant eternity. But the higher the temples rose, the further the rulers drifted from the people who built them. The king's duty to preserve order became justification for control. The priesthood's rituals became instruments of taxation and power. Faith, which had once united, began to divide. Obedience became the new language of devotion. Still, beneath this hierarchy, one truth endured. Humanity believed that meaning could defeat mortality. The idea that the memory of a name could outlast the dust of the body gave purpose to every act of creation. To build was to defy death. To write was to resist forgetting. In the halls of Uruk, scribes copied the deeds of Gilgamesh long after he was gone. His story spread across lands, retold in every language of the fertile valleys. It shaped the moral foundations of law, the pride of rulers, and the imagination of civilizations yet unborn. He failed to live forever, but through failure he gave humanity the key to eternity. The myth of the immortal king became the mirror of the human condition. Every ruler after him claimed divine descent, and every monument echoed the same lesson. To exist beyond death, one must leave something behind. As the centuries passed, kingship evolved. The ruler was no longer a servant of the gods but their embodiment. His bloodline was sacred, his face divine, his word eternal. The crown was not only a symbol of rule but the proof of immortality. In Sumer, the kings of Ur called themselves sons of the moon god Nana. In Akkad, Sargon claimed that the goddess Ishtar had chosen him at birth. In every kingdom, myth replaced inheritance. Power was no longer earned. It was inherited from the heavens. The temples reflected this transformation. Rituals that once honored the seasons became ceremonies of power. Each year, the sacred marriage of the king and the goddess was reenacted to ensure fertility for the land and legitimacy for the throne. Through this act, myth became politics. Faith became governance. The people saw their ruler as the bridge between worlds. When he spoke, it was the voice of heaven. When he ruled, it was the order of creation itself. When he died, his soul ascended to join the gods. The cycle of death and renewal was no longer only for nature. It belonged to kings. But immortality required proof. To preserve their image as divine, rulers began to build monuments greater than ever before. The ziggurat of Ur rose higher than the temple of Eridu, and the ziggurat of Babylon would later rise higher still. Each king sought to surpass the last, to prove that his connection to heaven was closer, his reign more eternal. The race for eternity transformed humanity's ambition. Cities became statements of faith. Palaces became symbols of divine hierarchy. Every inscription, every tower, every gate, declared that power could outlast time. Yet the earth watched in silence. The floods still came. The bricks still crumbled. The temples still fell. The kings had learned to build forever, but forever was shorter than they imagined. As the centuries turned, the great cities of Sumer began to fade. The rivers shifted. Salt poisoned the fields. Droughts returned. The gods who once blessed them now seemed distant. The old rituals failed to bring rain. The priests repeated their chants, but the heavens no longer answered. People began to ask what the temples could not explain. Some said the gods were angry. Others said the kings had lost their balance. But beneath the chaos, a deeper transformation was beginning. The idea of divinity itself was changing. From the ashes of Sumer rose new empires, Akkad, Lagash, Babylon. Each inherited the same dream of eternity. Each built upon the same myth. And each eventually learned the same truth. No city lasts forever. No ruler escapes time. The myth of the immortal king gave them identity, but it also blinded them to mortality. Still, the idea refused to die. The dream that began in Uruk traveled west, carried by merchants, scribes, and memory. It crossed deserts and mountains to reach another river. A river that flowed from the heart of Africa to the sea. A river that would give birth to another civilization that worshipped eternity itself. In that land, the sun was God, and the king was his living son. There, the belief that a ruler could live forever would no longer be a metaphor. It would be carved into stone. There, death would become a doorway to divinity. Egypt waited at the edge of the desert. The kings who dreamed of forever were about to build it. And the earth would remember. The desert was silence made visible. No trees, no wind, only the breath of the sun. Yet, through that silence, a river moved, carving a green line across eternity. Along its banks, life clung to existence, and existence began to worship the light. Here, humanity turned its eyes from the earth to the sky. The sun rose, and with it came a new idea. If the gods of Mesopotamia ruled through water and clay, then in this land, power descended with the dawn. The source of life was no longer beneath the soil. It burned above it. The Nile taught its people rhythm. Each year it flooded, each year it receded, each year it returned. Where Mesopotamia feared the flood, Egypt awaited it. The river's pulse was predictable, generous, eternal. To live by it was to witness resurrection written in water. From this pattern, belief took form. If the river could die and rise again, so could man. If the sun vanished each night and returned each morning, then death itself might only be another horizon. Immortality was no longer dream. It was schedule. The first kings of the Nile understood this before they ruled. They saw that order came not from fear, but from alignment. The kingdom would reflect the cosmos. The heavens above, the river below, and between them, a man who carried both. He was called Pharaoh. He was not chosen by the gods. He was the gods. the living Horus, the son of Ra, the keeper of Mat, the law of balance that held the universe together. His voice was justice. His breath was command. To obey him was to obey creation itself. Around him rose a civilization obsessed with eternity. Stone replaced clay. Geometry replaced myth. The same imagination that once carved stories into tablets now carved light into architecture. Temples aligned with solstices. Statues faced the sunrise. Even shadows were measured, charted, and sanctified. At Saqqara, the step pyramid of Djoser rose against the desert, the first mountain built by human hands from stone. It was designed not as a tomb, but as a stairway for the king's soul to ascend the sky. Each step a rung between earth and heaven, each block a promise to the gods that death would not break the order of the world. The priests called themselves servants of eternity. They mapped the heavens, recorded the floods, and kept the calendar that bound agriculture to divinity. Science and religion were one discipline. Observation was prayer. Precision was worship. The Egyptians did not see contradiction between reason and faith. To measure the stars was to confirm the perfection of creation. To preserve a body was to protect the vessel of the soul. Mummification was not vanity. It was technology in service of theology. Every ritual preserved symmetry. Every detail was a negotiation with forever. Inside the tombs, artisans painted scenes of daily life not to honor the past, but to guarantee continuity. Fishermen, bakers, children, and birds were drawn not as memories, but as instructions for the next life. The afterlife was not fantasy. It was bureaucracy, a world that functioned exactly like the living one, governed by the same laws, ruled by the same king. At the heart of it all was Mat, the balance between truth, order, and justice. When Pharaoh died, his heart would be weighed against the feather of Mat. If it was light, he would rise with the sun. If it was heavy, he would fall into darkness. Even in death, there was accountability. Through this belief, Egypt built stability unlike any before it. Where Mesopotamian kings ruled through fear of chaos, Egyptian kings ruled through faith and order. To rebel against Pharaoh was to break the balance of the cosmos. Revolt was not treason. It was sacrilege. For more than 2,000 years, that balance endured. Dynasty followed dynasty, each building upon the same foundation of stone and sunlight. Every new reign restored the cycle, proving that life itself could be renewed through ritual precision. History in Egypt was not a line. It was a circle of sunrise. The pyramids were the perfect symbol of that circle. They did not point to heaven. They anchored it. Each side faced a cardinal direction. Each angle reflected a mathematical harmony that echoed through the stars. The Great Pyramid at Giza stood as a cosmic instrument. Aligned with Orion's belt, its sides calibrated to the fraction of the planet's curve. It was both tomb and equation, both prayer and machine. Through it, humanity had turned faith into physics. When the people looked upon it, they did not see death. They saw continuity, a bridge between flesh and eternity, between the breath of man and the light of Ra. The stones themselves seemed to glow with memory, each one holding the silence of millions of hands who believed they were lifting a god toward the horizon. Pharaohs ruled not through conquest, but through the geometry of awe. They did not need armies to prove divinity. Their power was visible in the perfection of their monuments. Every stone declared that order could not die. Every shadow reminded the living that they were part of a structure larger than time. But perfection demands sacrifice. To keep the kingdom eternal, human life became replaceable. Farmers were drafted for construction. Craftsmen worked until exhaustion. Entire villages moved to serve a single tomb. Faith required bodies, and bodies became bricks of belief. The architecture of immortality was built on mortality itself. Even so, the people did not see cruelty. They saw purpose. To labor for Pharaoh was to participate in creation. To carve a stone was to carve meaning into existence. The kingdom had no separation between the sacred and the practical. Every act was devotion. Every life a thread in the fabric of eternity. The desert absorbed everything. Empires rose and fell, yet the monuments endured. The sun that once crowned Pharaoh still passed over his tombs, its light moving across faces carved thousands of years ago. In their silence, the statues seemed alive, still watching the horizon, still waiting for the next dawn. But eternity is never absolute. Even stone erodes. The Nile shifted its course. Famine came. Civil war followed. Priests argued over the will of the gods. The balance of Mat trembled. For the first time, heaven seemed divided. In the ruins of unity, new questions emerged. If Pharaoh could die, what truly was divine? If order could break, what held justice together? The people began to seek answers not only in the sky, but in themselves. The gods had once been distant, abstract, perfect. Now they were imagined with faces, emotions, and flaws. Divinity was becoming human. What began as the geometry of eternity was turning into the psychology of faith. The gods who once ruled nature would soon rule conscience. And power, once measured in stone, would soon be written into law. Civilization had learned to measure the stars and build eternity from stone, but eternity required meaning. The temples were no longer enough. The gods who ruled rivers and skies had become too distant, too silent. People began to imagine divinity not as force, but as presence. They wanted gods who could see them, hear them, and judge them. From the ruins of old kingdoms rose a new idea. The divine would no longer live only in the sun or in the flood. It would live in the heart, in law, in the mind that could tell right from wrong. In the valleys of Mesopotamia, scribes pressed codes into clay, each mark a promise of order. The first laws were born from the same hands that once carved prayers. What began as faith became justice. The will of the gods became the language of command. The code of Uranemmu spoke of punishment for theft and injury, written in the name of Nana, the moon god. The laws of Ishnana defined fair trade and protection for the weak. And on a tall black stone, more than 3,000 years before the modern age, a Babylonian king would carve the most complete of all, Hammurabi. He stood before the image of Shamash, god of truth and light. The god sat upon a throne, handing the king a rod and ring, the symbols of measurement and justice. To rule, Hammurabi declared, was to maintain balance between heaven and man. His words were both decree and scripture. Let the strong not oppress the weak. Let the law be the mirror of the gods. In that moment, something irreversible occurred. Morality, once cosmic, became written. The universe had learned grammar. Each law tablet was a fragment of eternity expressed in reason. The temple that once stored grain now stored codes. The priest who once measured floods now measured fairness. Faith had entered the human conscience. The divine was no longer only worshipped. It was obeyed. Across the Nile, a similar transformation unfolded. The heart, once weighed only in myth, became a moral scale within the living. Egyptian scribes wrote texts of guidance, hymns of judgment, prayers that spoke to both gods and conscience. They called it the instruction of Ptahhotep, the book of the dead, the negative confession. Each one was an attempt to map morality, the same way they had mapped the stars. The king remained divine, but now his divinity demanded virtue. Pharaoh ruled not because he was God by birth, but because he preserved Mat, the truth that kept the cosmos from collapse. When a ruler failed in justice, drought followed. When he kept balance, the floods returned. The link between ethics and nature had been forged. Elsewhere, new civilizations learned the same pattern. In the highlands of Anatolia, the Hittites carved treaties in stone, swearing loyalty before their storm god. In the valleys of the Levant, shepherd tribes turned covenant into law, believing their God spoke through fire and voice, not image. In each land, the story was the same. Faith became structure. Structure became rule. Rule became morality. The gods, once pure power, began to resemble their creators. They loved, raged, forgave, and punished. They were no longer storms but personalities. Their stories carried lessons. Their anger defined sin. Their mercy defined hope. Art began to change with them. No longer faceless symbols of eternity, the gods now had eyes, gestures, and emotions. In Mesopotamian reliefs, Shamash extended his rays like arms to bless the king. In Egypt, Isis held her child with tenderness. In QAnon, El and Asherah sat together beneath the tree of life. Divinity had entered the human form, and through it, humanity saw itself reflected. Language followed. The word for God in many tongues now shared its roots with words for good, order, and truth. The sacred and the moral became the same thing. To act justly was to act godly. To lie or betray was to disturb the fabric of the cosmos. The invention of writing had preserved memory. The invention of law preserved meaning. For the first time, morality was portable. It could be copied, carried, and taught. A child could inherit not just land but principle. In clay and papyrus, in stone and ink, the earth felt a new pulse. Humanity was learning to govern itself through symbols. The gods no longer needed to command storms or floods. They commanded conscience. But power never disappears. It only transforms. As priests became judges and kings became guardians of law, interpretation once again became control. Those who spoke in the name of truth could now define it. The same words that protected the weak could be used to bind them. The same law that brought justice could also sanctify rule. Every civilization discovered this tension. Between belief and obedience. Between order and freedom. Between the divine voice and the human ear. Still, within that struggle lay the seed of progress. For the first time, the idea of equality existed, even if only as an echo. The laws that served gods began to serve people. The idea that every life had value began to take root. I watched as cities grew wiser and more complex. The temples that once celebrated power now housed schools. Scribes became philosophers. Questions began to replace rituals. What is truth? What is justice? What does it mean to be good? In those questions, humanity began to create its own gods within. The kings still built monuments. The priests still guarded their altars. But beneath the grandeur, something fragile and beautiful was forming. Conscience had replaced fear. Responsibility had replaced obedience. Faith had become reflection. The rivers that once gave life to the first kingdoms now carried ideas. Clay tablets crossed borders. Papyrus scrolls traveled down the Nile and across the sea. Law had become civilization's language. But order is never permanent. Every structure, no matter how sacred, begins to crack under the weight of time. The gods of law would soon face the same question that haunted Gilgamesh. Can meaning survive power? Can justice survive those who claim to own it? The temples still stood. The laws were still read. But beneath their stone, I could feel a new current moving. People were beginning to ask not what the gods wanted, but why they were silent. And when they began to answer that question themselves, the world would change again. The world had learned to live within the walls of law. Temples had become courts. Kings spoke the language of justice. But justice, once divine, was now questioned by those it ruled. In the cities that once worshipped the heavens, doubt began to move like wind through corridors of stone. It did not destroy faith. It examined it. The same minds that had measured the stars began to measure truth itself. I watched as scholars pressed questions into clay instead of decrees. They wrote of purpose, of destiny, of the limits of power. They asked what no ruler had dared to ask. If gods created man, who created the idea of gods? The old certainties began to soften. In Sumer and Akkad, the stories of creation that once spoke of divine order were retold as metaphors. In Egypt, hymns that praised eternal kings now spoke of wisdom, compassion, and humility. In the hills of the Levant, prophets emerged, warning that justice without mercy was hollow. The gods were no longer voices of thunder. They were reflections of conscience. Power had reached its summit, and at that height, it began to see its own shadow. Empires rose, united under faith, then collapsed under their own weight. Each claimed to serve the divine. Each became the measure of its own god. The more they sought eternity, the faster time moved through them. The kings of Babylon looked upon their ziggurats and saw emptiness where all once lived. The priests who guarded the laws realized that law alone could not feed the hungry or calm the heart. Civilization had achieved permanence, but it had forgotten purpose. So humanity began to look inward. From faith came philosophy. From obedience came understanding. The same clay that once carried prayers now carried arguments. In the cities of the Aegean, people gathered not around altars but in open squares. They questioned the order of the world not to defy it, but to know it. They studied the movement of the stars, the harmony of music, the patterns of reason. They spoke of logos, the principle that connected thought and universe. It was the same rhythm I had carried since the first rivers flowed, but now they could hear it. For the first time, humanity did not need a voice from heaven to name what was good. They found it in empathy, in reason, in the quiet courage to doubt. The gods did not vanish. They changed shape. They moved from the sky into story, from the temple into the mind. I felt the shift within me. The earth that had once spoken through storms, now spoke through reflection. Each generation built fewer monuments and more ideas. The dream of living forever became the dream of being understood. But every revelation carries its shadow. When belief became knowledge, pride returned. When knowledge became power, the cycle began again. The same tools that freed the mind would later forge new chains. The same curiosity that sought truth would one day build machines to dominate it. Still, I remembered what had begun this journey. A spark in the darkness, a whisper in clay, a question carved in stone. From Göbekli Tepe to Uruk, from the Nile to Babylon, humanity had searched for meaning through creation. They learned to shape the world, then to shape themselves. The first kings dreamed of forever. They built it in stone, in story, in law. And though the monuments have fallen, the dream remains. Not as power, but as memory. The earth still carries their echoes. In the dust of broken ziggurats. In the shadows of pyramids. In the words that survived fire and flood. Their voices do not command now. They remind. What they built was never about control. It was about continuity. The will to keep remembering, even when the heavens are silent. I am the earth. I remember the songs of those who once called themselves divine. They shaped me as I shaped them. Through them, I learned that immortality is not in temples or crowns. It is in understanding. And though ages will rise and fall, though gods will change their names, one truth endures. Everything that seeks eternity must first learn to listen. Because only what remembers, truly lives. Echoes of Sapiens, if stories like this remind you what it means to be human, subscribe, and keep exploring with us.